Good morning. We begin by thanking the sponsors of the TALMUD Torah in today's daf. The TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. We thank the Daf Yomi Shiur, everybody here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for sponsoring Daf Yomi for the month, for the TALMUD Torah for the month, in the memory of Mr. Milton Marder, Mordechai Dovid ben Rephael HaKohen. May his neshama have an aliyah, may the family have a neshama. We also thank Shirley Elbaum Family for sponsoring TALMUD Torah for this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shirley's husband, Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel ben R Avraham Menachem. Again, the neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have a neshama. The Week of Learning is sponsored by Paul and Kathy Pollack in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Paul's sister Linda, Leah bas Shmuel, as well as in the zchus of refuah shalaimah for Rabbi Dovid Katz, Dovid HaCohen ben Leah, who will be undergoing open heart surgery this week. Should have a refuah shalaimah. We also thank Saeed and Sima Haken for sponsoring the learning this week. Leah Nishmat Sima's mother, Miriam bat Elazar, and Sima's father, Yechezkel Ben Aga Saleh. The neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have a neshama. Daf Yomi is sponsored today by Alan and Sue Myrowitz in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Sue's mother, Mindel Futeral, Mindel bas Reb Shlomo Tadris. Again, the neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have a neshama. Today's daf is daf Ayin Beis Maseches Nedarim. We are going to just remind ourselves of the question we asked at the end of yesterday's daf, which was a question about an individual who divorced his wife and then remarried her. So just a quick reminder: when an oros, a person who married a girl with kedushin, when he discovers that his wife has a neder, he has three options. Option number one, which is do nothing, and if he chooses to do nothing, then by the end of the day he can no longer do anything. The neder takes effect, and the neder is essentially it's going to be there. And he does not have the ability anymore to be made for the neder. Or he can be making the neder. He can actually uphold the neder, which makes it irreversible. Or on that very day, he could just wipe out that neder. We discussed that when an oros, a husband who is only a husband after only kedushin, only has the ability to do that together as a partner with her father. Now the question is, when a person divorces his wife, we'll just read it inside again. 4 lines from the bottom of Yivayilu. Gerushin kishtika damya, oy ka'akama damya. When a person divorces his wife after she makes a neder, again referring to an aros, someone who only did kedushin, not nisuin. How do we view the gerushin? Is it like shtika, or is it ka'akama, like actually upholding the neder? Obviously, there is no tzad. There is no way to think that it should be like hafara. Hafara actually has to be hafara. So he certainly didn't uproot the neder. He didn't wipe out the neder. The question is it positively upholding the neder, or is it just doing nothing? And what's the difference? What's the difference? Kegain shenadra v'shama baila. She took a neder. Her husband heard about it. Vigirsha, he divorced her. V'ahadra biyome, he remarried her again on that day. So amar mar kishtika damya. If the halacha is like it's like shtika, so then essentially he did nothing. And therefore, matzimei farla, in the second marriage, he can go ahead and uproot that neder, he can be made for it. If we're going to say that it is like a kama, like upholding the neder, so then he no longer has the ability to uproot the neder, and therefore, lo matzimei farla, he no longer has the ability to be made for the neder, to wipe out that neder. So the Gemara is going to begin by bringing a number of rayas. I just wanted to point out that why would we say that divorcing his wife is like a kama? In other words, previously we learned that a kama actually has to have an actual hakama. He has to say, I'm upholding the neder. So why should it be? What's the reason that I should believe that a person divorcing his wife should be like hakama? So the Ran explains that, if you want to see it, it is 6 lines from the bottom on Ayin Aleph and Beis. He says, Mishom dekivan de yada aros, to the basar gerushin lo matzi mefer. He's only allowed to be made for her nedarim while she's married, while they're married, and he knows that once they're divorced, he no longer has the ability to be made for the neder. So then, V'lo hafer kodem gerishin command to ukme lenidra dami kechi darminin b'chi lo hafer bayom shmua command to ukme dami. Just like a person knows that if the day passes without him being made for the neder, he no longer has the ability to be made for the neder. So the fact is, he knows that once he's no longer relevant to this case because he divorced her, he knows that if they're divorced, he can't be made for her neder. So the fact that he chooses not to be made for the neder, but instead to divorce her, says the Ran, that's the reason why I would think it's like a hakama, because he is really absolving his ability to, he's losing the ability to be able to be made for the neder. Okay, now the Gemara attempts to bring a number of rayas as to whether or not divorce is like hakama, or perhaps maybe it's like shtika. The Gemara says, Tashma, let's come and try to bring a raya to this. And we bring the following case. Emasai Amru, Mesa Baal, Nisrok Nurishus La'av. When have we said that when the husband dies, the jurisdiction now transfers entirely to the father? In other words, we've seen this a number of times, that if the husband dies, then his ability to be made for the neder is obviously gone because he's dead. Now everything goes back to the father, and the father has the ability to be made for, to nullify the vow on his own. And the Gemara says, Bizman shelo shama abal. That's talking about when the husband died, when he did not yet hear about the neder, or oshama v'hafer, or he heard about the neder and he did everything that he can to get rid of it. So he heard about the neder and he was made for it. Oshama v'shasak umeispo bayom. Or it's talking about a case where he heard about it and he was quiet, and on that very day when he still had time to be made for the neder, that is when he died. Now, if you're going to tell me that gerushin, divorcing one's wife, is similar to shtika, lisni nami oshama v'giresh, why don't we add that case? In other words, if the halacha is being quiet, is a case where the jurisdiction transfers back to the father, then let's list any case which is like being quiet. And if being quiet, and if divorcing one's wife is like being quiet with regard to her neder, add that case. So midelo tani hachi, from the fact that the Brisa did not actually include that case, the case of divorcing one's wife, shma mina gerish and kakamadamu. Gemara says it must be that the reason why this case was not included is because it's not true. In other words, we can infer from the fact that this Brisa did not quote the case of divorcing his wife as a case of shtika, that it must be that the reason why it's not listed there is because had he divorced her, the jurisdiction would not transfer back to the father, rather it's like a hakama. Gemara says, hold on a second. Ema seifa. You have to look at the end of that brisa. Aval im shama v'kiyem. If he heard about the neder and the husband actually upheld the neder, shama v'shasak, or he heard about the neder and then he was quiet, umeis b'yom shel achrav, so he was quiet and waited until the next day to die, then ein yachal hafer, he cannot be made for the neder. So hold on a second. If you're telling me that a person divorcing his wife is similar to actually upholding the neder, lisni vim shama v'giresh, so include that case in the second half. Elami dolot katani hachi, from the fact that that case was not included in the Seifa, Shema mina gerushin kishtika damu. Must be that being quiet is similar to, it must be that divorcing one's wife is similar to actually being quiet, and indeed he would be able to be made for the neder when he remarries her later that day. In other words, we can infer the opposite from each case of the Brisa. That the Reisha seems, again, both cases exclude the case of divorcing his wife. So from the fact that it was excluded in the first case gives us that inference to tell us that it's not true. In other words, it's not like a shtika. The second case, again, omits the case of divorcing his wife. So therefore, we can infer from there that divorcing one's wife is not like a hakama. So we're stuck that we have a stira in the mashmos of this brisa. The Gemara says, "Ela mihal like a lamashma minei." From this brisa, we can't say anything because Iresha Dafka, if the Resha specifically left out that case because it wanted to infer what the halacha would be with Gerushin, then Nasa Seifa Mishum Resha. Then that means that we learned the second half only because of the Resha, which means, and the Ran explains this, that we wanted this price to be symmetrical. So therefore, we included each case and the exclusion of that case. But we couldn't have a symmetrical case for the Resha and the Seifa when it came to divorcing. Just to see the Ran inside, it's the third line from the top. Iresha Dafka, Lo Matzi Lemisna Gerushin, we couldn't include the case of Gerushin, Mishum Dika Hakama Damu. That it's like Hakama, because Nasu Seifa Mishum Resha, Lo Baila Misni Beseifa Gavna, Chadata El Lahafuchinu Legavna de Resha. We just wanted to flip around the case of the Resha. In other words, if the Resha was Dafka, then the Seifa was just brought there as the flip side of that case. But we couldn't find the flip side of the case when it comes to Gerushin. In other words, you can't have one case of Gerushin that would work and one case of Gerushin that wouldn't work. And then, Iseifa Dafka Nasav Resha Mishum Seifa. In other words, if the Seifa, if the second half, is actually going to be the correct one, which is Dafka, so we couldn't find the flip side of the case of Gerushin, which would have worked. Now, it happens to be Rabbi Kiva and the Gilead Nashas over here tries to come up with a case. I'm having a difficult time understanding exactly what he means, but just to see what he says, he writes Temuali. The Kiva is in the Gilead Nashas. Most Gemaras would be that third section, all the way to the right by the column. Gilead Nashas. Baharan Dibur Amaskal Iresha Demasla Fuchinu Temuali asks Rabbi Kiva. Inami Masni Beresha Shama Vashasak Vigirsha Bo Bayom. He could have listed in the first case, he heard about it, and he was quiet, and then he divorced her on that day. That would be a case which is similar to shtika, to being quiet, which he can then go ahead and nullify the vow if he remarries her. And having matzi laf buche beseifa, we could have come up with a case where we'll flip it around in the seifa, which is shama v'shasak v'girshal lamachar. He heard about it, he was quiet, and he divorced her the next day. That would be ukumo de katani b'misa, like we said by misa. That would be a case where he no longer has the ability to be made for the net, just like he was mekayim it. The reason why I don't really understand this, because again, it doesn't seem to be so symmetrical. It's the reason why he can't be made for it has nothing to do with the divorce. It has to do with the fact that he waited till tomorrow. So that's why I don't really understand Kiveger's question, but he says, Hashem ya'ar eini. He obviously understood that, and he didn't ask for Aryeh Richter to be mayor his inayim. He asked for Hashem to be mayor his inayim. So it must be something that I'm missing in the question over here. But again, Kiveger wants to say that we could have come up with a case which can be flipped around in both cases. I'm having a little bit of difficulty. If anybody understands it, I am open to suggestions. Okay, thank you. So Gemara says, "El mihalak el mashmini reisha dafka the seifa mishum reisha, he seifa dafka the reisha mishum seifa." Whatever it is, whichever one was dafka, we don't know. But either way, the other side of this brisa was really brought just to be the symmetrical flip side of the case. So Gemara says, "Okay, Tashma, let's try again. We're still trying to prove how do we view Gerushin, one divorcing his wife after he hears an neder that she makes." So the Gemara says, Tashma, Nadra, she makes a neder, Vahi Arusa, and she is an Arusa, V'nis Garsha, V'nis Arsa Babayom. So this is a familiar Mishnah, we've learned this just before. A lady makes a neder, Vahi Arusa, while she is Arusa, V'nis Garsha, she gets divorced, and V'nis Arsa, she does Erisin again that same day. Afilu Lameya, even if she repeats this process 100 times, Halach is Avia, Ubayla Ha'achron, Mefirin Nidareh. Her father and her latest husband can be the ones, or the current husband can be the one to be made for her Nedarim. So hold on a second. Shmamina, Gerushin Kishtika Damu. Isn't that an open raya? The Gerushin is Kishtika? Why? Because the first guy divorced her. Now, what happens? The second husband, or the third husband, or the 100th husband can go ahead and be made for the neder. Now, if the first one divorced her, and divorcing one's wife is like being mekayim the neder, upholding the neder, then how could the last husband go ahead and be made for it? Shmamina gerushin kishtikadamu. Di kakama. If it's like kakama, mimatzi mefer aros achron nidri to okim aros rishon. Is it possible for the last husband to go ahead and be mefer to uproot, to nullify the vows, the Nedarim, that the first husband upheld? The Gemara says, that's talking about a case where the first husband did not hear about it. Now, hold on a second, says the Gemara. If it's talking about a case where the first husband never heard about it, so then, my area bo bayom, why does the Mishnah say bo bayom? The halacha is biyom shamo. The husband nullifies the vows on the day that he hears about it. The husband never heard about it. Then all those previous husbands, all those divorces and remarriages are irrelevant. The husband never heard about it. It depends when you heard about it. The Gemara says the bo bayom that's written in the Mishnah is not talking about the husband. It's talking about the father. Kishelo shama aros v'shama av. It's talking about a case where the aros, the husband, did not hear about it. However, the father heard about it. The bo bayom on that day, who dematzi made for? That's when the father can be made for the Nedarim. Going on from there, lo matzi mefer, the father can no longer be made for the Nedarim, and it has a ripple effect that the husband can't do it either, because the husband has to be a partner with the father. Now, just remember, this is not consistent with the way that Shmuel, on the previous Amud, on yesterday's Amud, interpreted the Mishnah. Shmuel said very clearly that he learned from his Rebbe that the Mishnah was actually referring to the husband and talking about a case where the husband heard about it. I should have pointed this out earlier, but according to Shmuel, this whole case is not relevant. Because simply according to Shmuel, we know that the husband heard about it, and the husband was not made for the neder, and then she got divorced and remarried. So according to Shmuel, the question is not even relevant. The whole question that the Gemara asks is, assuming that we don't paskin like Shmuel. But again, we have no answer to the question yet. Tashema. The Gemara makes one final attempt. Nadra, she takes a neder, bo bayom, on that day. Girsha, he divorces her. Vichzira bo bayom. So we have a brayso which is mamash very similar to our case. She takes a neder, he divorces her, he remarries her on that same day. What's the halacha? Ein yachel lahafer. He's not allowed to be made for the neder. Shema mina. We see clearly, divorcing one's wife is like upholding the neder. The Gemara says, no, Amri Hacha, that case is not similar to the case of the Ibaya on Daf Ayin Aleph Amabez. It's not similar to our case. Why? Because that case is talking about the Nesua Askinan, when she already had Nisuin, so she was fully married. This is the reason why he can no longer be made for the neder. Mishum de'ein baal abal mefer b'kodmin. A baal cannot cure a pre-existing condition of a neder that his wife had taken before nisuin. In other words, our case is talking about where it's erusin. There's only erusin. It's only kiddushin that took place, but not nisuin. So that's where we're talking about if the neder could transfer from one aris to the next aris, to the next aris, to the next aris. However, this case is talking about when at least one of them was talking about nisuin, where there was nisuin. The Ran explains that this is talking about, it doesn't make a difference if the first marriage was nisuin, and the second one is erusin, or the first one was erusin, the second one was nisuin. The bottom line is, if any of them had nisuin involved, that would be a case where you can no longer be made for the neder, because either the reason is because she's in a nesua, and therefore it really takes the father out of the scene. In other words, let's just go through it in our minds. If in the first marriage she was in a nesua, she did nisuin, then the father's out. If the father's out, so then the oros has no partner to be made for the neder with, so we can't do it. If it's talking about the first case was erusin, and the second case was nisuin, which is the culmination of the marriage, then the problem is that a person who marries a woman with nisuin no longer has the ability to be made for pre-existing nedarim. That's what we mean by ein abal mefer b'kodmin. So if it's talking about nisuin, that's why the father can't do it. But we don't yet have an answer with regard to what the halacha is going to be. If an aros divorces his, we'll go in order. If an aros hears his wife make a neder, and he is not made for the neder, rather he divorces her, and then he remarries her on that day, we don't have any case which can ultimately prove to us whether or not in the second marriage, on that same day, you could go ahead and be made for the neder. So if you look at the Ran quotes the opinion of the Ramban. It's the third very wide line on this page. Ulinin halacha kasav Ramban kiven debayan lo ishita. Since the Gemara was not able to resolve this question, naktivan lechumra. We're going to be machmir, stringent, de gerushin ka'kamadamu, v'hacha v'hecha de nadra v'shama ba'al v'girsha v'ahadra b'yomei lo motzi meifrala. In such a case, where she took a neder, he divorced her, he remarried her on that day, then indeed he would not be able to be made for the neder. Now, the Rajba, Harajba Zal, Kasav Nihida Band Lo Ishita Mianach Masdisen, the Misnaya Allah, Ishita La Mimember Shmuel. So says, I won't read the whole thing, but says the Ran in the name of the Rashba, it's true that we could not find an independent source to go ahead and resolve this question. However, remember, we only asked this question not according to Shmuel, but Shmuel himself interpreted our Mishnah on Daf Ayin Aleph Amad Aleph in a way which would absolutely answer this question. So you're right that you asked the question not according to Shmuel, but says the Rashba, here I am as a posek, and I want to answer this question. Very nice, you asked the question not according to Shmuel, but we do have someone by the name of Shmuel who had a Kabbalah from his Rebbeim that the previous Mishnah actually is a resolution to this question. What's the previous Mishnah? She makes a neder, she's in Narusa, she gets divorced, she remarries. The Mishnah says clearly that her husband can be made for the neder. Now it's true that our Gemara interpreted the Mishnah differently, but that's not how Shmuel's Rebbe learned the Mishnah. Shmuel's Rebbe learned the Mishnah that it's talking about a case where the husband heard about it, and the husband was quiet, and then another person came by and married her, and clearly the halacha is the second one, or the third one, or the 100th husband of that day is allowed to be made for the neder. So if that's true, clearly according to Shmuel and his Rebbeim, the halacha would be that Gerushin is kishtika, it's not like hakama, and therefore that would resolve this question, it would answer this question. So says the Rashba, we certainly do have an answer to this question according to Shmuel, and we could definitely rely on Shmuel to answer this question. So, if anybody is ever approached by somebody who did only erison, did not do nisuin, and their wife took a neder, and they were quiet on that day, and they divorced their wife that day, and they decided to remarry their wife that day, and wants to be made for the neder, you can tell them that they can be somech on Shmuel to be made for that neder. Halach l'maisa. We continue with the Mishnah on the top of Daf Ayin Beis, Amud Beis. Terach Tamidei Chachamim. So we're learning about the way of Tamidei Chachamim. So I think it's always important to point out, if you have a Mishnah which says Terach Tamidei Chachamim, but the Mishnah, I think, in my opinion, is telling you, if you want to at least act like a Talmud Chacham, this is what you should do. There are some people who, whenever they see the words Derech Tamidei Chachamim, that's not talking about me, that's talking about the Tamidei Chachamim. The Mishnah is clearly writing this for the Hamonam, and the Mishnah is telling us something that Tamidei Chachamim would normally do, but this is the derech, the proper way for a person to act. So the Mishnah says, Derech Tamidei Chachamim, the ad shalo haisa bita yotzas miyatzlo omer la kol nadarim shnedarat b'soch beisi harehin mufara. So again, practically speaking, the lesson of learning from Derech Tamidei Chachamim is relevant to us, but most likely not in this case. Most of our 12-year-old daughters are not getting married at that age, and again, the whole concept of aros, erison, and nisuin pretty much happens instantaneously the way that we do our chasnas now. So very much of this is not going to be relevant practically, but again, we still learn a very important lesson from this Mishnah, which we'll get to very soon. So what would a Talmud Chacham do? His daughter is getting married, so right before she gets married, or right before she enters into nisuin, he says to her, Omer la kol nadarim shenadarta b'soch beisi, any nadarim that you took upon yourself in my house, harehein mufarim, they should be nullified. V'chein abal, so to a husband, ad shalot tikanis l'shuso, right before he actually does nisuin, Omer la, he says to her, kol nadarim shenadarta ad shalot tikanis l'shusi, all nadarim that you took upon yourself before I actually did nisuin with you, harehein mufarim, they are nullified. In other words, both a husband and a father, right before they lose their ability to be able to be made for the Nedarim, they say to their child or to their wife, I'm just letting you know that any Nedarim that you have taken upon yourself, I am officially nullifying those Nedarim. So now the Gemara asks a fundamental question. By Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama has the following question. Baal ma'u sheyafer b'lo shmiya. And it's important to note that the Ran says, when it says Baal over here, it's just an example, because it could either be in Aros, it could be after Nisuin, it could also be talking about the father. What's the halacha? What's the halacha with regard to a person being made for the Nedarim of his wife or his daughter without actually hearing about it? Again, the pasuk says Biyom Shama. The Gemara is going to explain. It says V'shama Isha. The pasuk says her husband will hear about it. Isha with the yud means her husband. V'shama Isha, her husband hears about it. Is that dafkahu or lav dafka? In other words, is the pasuk telling you a halacha that he actually has to really hear about it, or as the Ran explains, is it orcha de milsa nakat? Is it just the normal way of things happening that a person hears his wife make a neder and then he's going to nullify it? Why? Because if he doesn't hear about it, then how does he know about it? Or is the lav dafka? It's not a halachic aspect that he has to hear about it. It's just normal for that to happen. So that's the Gemara's question. What's the halacha? Can a husband or a father be made for the nedarim of his wife or his daughter without actually hearing about the neder? The Gemara explains, V'sham isha dafka, who is it dafka that he has to hear about it, olav dafka, or is it not specifically talking about it, rather that's just the normal way of doing it? Amar Rava. Rava says the following, Tashema, derech tamid chachamim, ad shelo yatzis bitum yetzlo. It is the proper way of Talmidei Chachamim that just as his daughter is about to leave his rishus, Omar law, he says to her, Kol nedarim shenadarti b'soch beisi. Any nedarim that you have taken upon yourself in my house, harehein mufarim, they are going to be nullified. So hold on a second, holo shama. This Mishnah itself is a strange Mishnah. How can you say Kol nedarim, any neder that you made, he didn't hear about this nedarim? So the Gemara says, l'chishamahu. What he means is, when I will hear about it, who may for? In other words, he's just giving notice that when he does eventually hear about the neder, he wants to be made for it. Gemara says in Cain, Kilo Shama, Lamali Lebeimar. In other words, if it doesn't even work, why is he bothering? In other words, if you're telling me that he has to actually hear the neder in order to go ahead and nullify it, so then what's the whole point in this derech tamidei chachamim? Guy goes to his daughter and says, by the way, I'm letting you know that if you'll make a neder, and I'll hear about it, I'm going to be made for it. What's the point in all of that? It doesn't even work. The Gemara says, so this is actually where the lesson of Tamidei Chachamim comes in. It's the normal way of Tamidei Chachamim la'adure to actually initiate the conversation. And the Ran explains that really is just it's an opener of a conversation to try to get her to start talking about the nedarim that she might have. In other words, the father goes to his daughter right before she gets married and says, hey, listen, I want you to know that after you get married, I'm no longer going to be able to be made for the nedarim. After Nisuin happens, I'm no longer able to handle your nedarim for you. So I just want you to know that if you have any nedarim, now is the time to speak up. Let me know about those nedarim. It's like this, I can do what I need to do to get rid of them before you get married. In other words, that will ultimately encourage her to share the information, which would provide the opportunity for him to be made for those nedarim bo bayo. So he's facilitating a conversation which he hopes will result in her revealing some of the nedarim that she took upon herself. It's like this, he can, at that point, be made for those nedarim. And now we can really understand what this idea of derech tamidei chachamim is. That again, he's really not doing what he has to do, because he could just say, "Listen, I never heard about her nedarim. I'm not obligated to go chase her down and find out about her nedarim." But here we see the father wants to go take an extra step to find out maybe there's a neder here, and that's the idea of derech tamidei chachamim. That he takes the extra step to find out about it. So Tashma, again, we don't yet have a raya to this case. In other words, we understand that our Mishnah is a father attempting to be made for the nedarim, but it doesn't prove to us anything with regard to whether or not he can be made for a neder without actually hearing about it. So Gemara continues, Tashema, Miseifa, from the second half of the Mishnah. V'chein abal, Similarly, a husband, ad shalot tikanas l'reshuso, before he actually does nisuin and brings her into his possession or to his life, Omer lo, he says to her, hachanami. Oh, sorry. Omer lo, he says to her, which In other words, he says to her, any nedarim that you have upon yourself, I'm going to be made for this. The Gemara says, hachanami, the Omer lo l'chisha mana. He says to her, when I hear about it. In other words, again, the raya would have been the same. Mishnah says, a husband says to his wife, any nedarim that you have that I haven't heard about, I want to be made for them. So clearly we see that he is able to be made for nedarim that he didn't hear about. The Gemara says, no, hachanami, this is also talking about where it doesn't mean that he is being made for them now without hearing about it. Rather, he's saying, when I will hear about them, I will at that point in time be made for those nedarim. Now I should point out that the Ran explains that this might be different. I just want to make sure this is a little bit complicated, so I'll just explain it outside as best as I can. But when it comes to the father really is standing at that last point in time that he has any jurisdiction over his daughter's nedarim. So he says to her, just as she's about to go do nesuin, listen up. If you have any nedarim, I want to let you know that as soon as I hear about them, I'm going to be made for them. What's the point? The point in that is that she should tell him, it's like this, he can be made for those nedarim. However, when it comes to the husband, the truth is, this is not his last opportunity to be made for the nedarim of his wife. As a matter of fact, as after nesuin, he has sole jurisdiction over it, and he doesn't even need the father anymore. So his ability to be made for nedarim actually gets better. The only problem is that a neder that was relevant during Erusin, that already he can't go ahead and do after Nisuin. So now the question is, perhaps the Lechisha Mana in the case of the husband is different than the Lechisha Mana in the case of the father. In other words, Lechisha Mana means when I will hear about it. When it comes to the father, Lechisha Mana, when I will hear about it, obviously has to mean when I will hear about it, I will at that point in time nullify your neder. When it comes to the husband, it could be that Lechisha Mana, when I will hear about it, I will retroactively be made for it from now. There's a possibility that that can work. In other words, he's starting the hafara now. And what he's accomplishing is that normally, if a husband hears about a neder, which took place during Erusin, after Nesuin, he no longer has the ability to be made for it, because that's considered kodmin. That's a pre-existing neder. What if now, during Erusin, he already began the process of the hafara? In other words, he said, right now I'm an aros. Right now I didn't hear about your neder yet. Right now I don't know about it, but I'm letting you know that right now, as an aros, I am starting that treatment process on your nedarim. Perhaps that actually can work to allow him to be made for those nedarim after Nesuin. So while the Gemara uses the words Lechisha Mana, which means when I will hear about it, and it seems like the Gemara is using those words equally for a husband as it is for a father, the truth is, says the Ran, it could be dramatically different. When it comes to a father, his ability to be made for nedarim is done once she becomes a Nesua. When it comes to a husband, once she becomes a Nesua, any nedarim that he hears about then, he can be made for without a problem. Then the only issue is a neder from Erusin transferring to Nesuin. That's where he can't do it anymore because that's considered kodmin. That's considered to be a pre-existing neder that he can't be made for. Says the Ran, it's possible that when a husband tells his wife during Erusin that I'm being made for all your nedarim, I'm nullifying all your nedarim, actually he does accomplish something very big. That he now is able to be made for nedarim after Nesuin that happened during Erusin because he started the process as an aros. But again, it doesn't prove to us that he can actually effectively be made for the neder without hearing about it now. Okay, so again, we don't have a raya yet. Tashema, the Gemara attempts to bring another raya as to whether or not a person can be made for a neder without hearing about it. Homer leishto, person tells his wife, Kohen darim shetaduri, any nedarim that you will make ad sha'avo mimakum ploni harehein kayamin lo amar klum. So a person's traveling. Person goes away on business, and before he leaves, he wants to settle all his affairs with his wife, and he says, by the way, I want to let you know any nedarim that you take while I'm gone, harei hein kayamin. I'm certifying those Nedarim. I'm authenticating those Nedarim, and they will work. The halach is lo amar klum. That's nothing. Why? The simple understanding is because it's a davar shlo b'la olam. A person cannot go ahead and be made for something which doesn't exist. Others explain that it's not possible that his kiyum, his upholding of those Nedarim actually was done with sincerity, because he has no idea what she's going to say. Remember, he's gone. He's out of town. And who knows what she's going through while he's out of town. And she may say all kinds of things, and she may actually make an eder, which is quite embarrassing for him. And he doesn't want that neder to happen. So how could it be that right now he upholds that neder? It's too early. Either because it's lo bala olam, it never happened, or because maybe he just really won't be sincere about it. So that's why lo amar klum. Harehin mufarin. If he does the opposite, he says any neder that you're going to make while I'm gone, until I come back, they are mufar. Rabbi Elazar Omar mufar. Actually, it works. Hold on a second. How could it be he's being made for the neder? Vaha lo shama. He didn't hear about it. So perhaps we have a riot from here that a person, at least according to Rabbi Elazar, and the truth is, the Ran explains that this question is not only according to Rabbi Elazar. Chacham only really argued in the first case, but it could be that they agree in the second case as well. But the idea over here is he doesn't hear about it. Where it says Hachanami to Amar lechishamana. He says when I hear about it. In other words, when I hear about those Nedarim, I'll be made for them. So the Gemara says if that's the case, V'lamali min hashta. So why does he have to do it now? In other words, why do this whole thing to say that I'll be made for it beforehand if he means to be made for it when he hears about it? Where it says, L'chisham alafarla. In other words, Gemara says, V'lamali mishum hashta. Why does he have to min hashta? Why does he have to do this now? Why can't he just do it when he hears about it? The Gemara says, Kasavar dilma mitaridna dehishaita. Again, he comes back after a long business trip. He has no idea how many things he's going to have to catch up on when he gets back home. So he wants to make sure that everything is settled beforehand. So he just says, I want to let you know that when I come back, any Nedarim that you make while I'm gone, it's on my to-do list to be made for those Nedarim as soon as it happens. In other words, as soon as I hear about it, that's when I'm going to be made for those Nedarim. So again, we have no raya whether or not a person can be made for a neder if he doesn't hear about it. So the Gemara tries one more attempt. Tashma, let's come again and try to bring a raya. Ha'omer la'patropis. Kol nedarim shenodarta shenoderis ishti mikan v'at sha'avo makomploni hafer. So here, apotropis is a manager. Generally, when we use the term apotropis, it's a person who is in charge of the possessions of a yasom, of orphans. Orphans die. Orphans are left without a father, and they have nobody to take care of their possessions. So the Beis Din appoints an apotropis, a financial manager, to oversee their affairs. In this case, apotropis means a person has a hired hand who oversees his affairs while he is gone. So a person says to this person, he's his manager, he's his asset manager, he says to him, listen, I'm going away, I have business to take care of, you'll be in my home taking care of everything that needs to be taken care of. Just want to let you know, if you hear my wife make any Nedarim, any of those Nedarim, you should go ahead and be made for them. So now what happens? Hafer v'haferla. And indeed, this guy takes full advantage as being the substitute husband. He's being made for all Nedarim, left and right. So the halach is, Yachal, you would think, Yehu Mufarim. You would think it works. Talmud Lomar, the Pasuk teaches you, Isha yikimenu v'isha yifirenu. The Pasuk repeats the word Isha twice. Her husband is repeated twice in the Pasuk to tell you that no, an apotropis can't do this. It's only a husband who has the right to be made for the Nedarim of his wife. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan, Metzinu chalatara kula. Bionasan. Amar lo Rabbi Yonasan, Metzinu chalatara kula, we find throughout all the Torah, shlucha shaladim kamoso. A person can indeed appoint a shliach to discharge his duty for him. And therefore we have Machlokes Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshia. So now the Gemara says, "Afil Rabbi Yoshia lo ka'amar ela mishum digzer sekasavu ishi kimenu ishi firenu aval dekuli alma shlucha shladu kamoso v'halo lo shmi alei." In other words, just understanding what's happening here. There's a technical machlokes over here as to whether or not a shliach can be made for the Nedarim of his wife, because the pasuk says ishi kimenu v'ishi firenu. In other words, everyone would technically agree that barring a gzeras hakasov, another person can go ahead and be made for the Nedarim. Now, if that's the case, so then, hold on a second. But he didn't hear about it. In other words, you're right that technically, according to Rabbi Yoshia, the shliach can't do it. But why is it? That's just a technicality. In other words, if without that pasuk telling you that he's ineligible to be made for the Nedarim, it would work through shlichus. Now hold on a second, but the husband never heard about the neder. So we have a raya from here. We should at least attempt a raya from here that a shliach can be made for the Nedarim without the husband hearing about the neder. Now why can't he be a shliach to hear about the neder? It's so clear. Ruvain is the husband. He has his wife, her name is Leah. Ruvain goes away and says to Shimon, you're my apotropos, you're my manager of my affairs. If my wife makes a neder, I want you to go ahead and be made for those nedarim. There's a technical machlokas whether or not Shimon, as a shliach or as an apotropos, can go ahead and be made for the nedarim. According to Rabbi Yoshia, he can't because the pasuk excludes him. But let's say we wouldn't have that gzeras hakasov. Everyone would agree that shlichus works. Everyone can agree that you can have an agent do something for you. There happens to be a technical problem which excludes him. Now, how would that shlichus work? The husband never heard about it. Now, why can't it be that the shliach is the shliach to hear about it? So there's two different approaches. The Ran explains that it's the last round on the page. Kolomar Baal Amalo Boishmia. V'chi Tema. Lest you say La'olam Emalach to Boishmia, and actually you do need to have that the person will hear about it. V'shani Hacha to Ika Shmia da Apotropos. It's fine that the Apotropos heard about it. The Kimi the Shluchos Shladon Kamoso Havale Kilu Shama Baal Tirtzu Betosvis B'Shem Rabbi Yosef Delesa. Dem Itza de Boishmia Miika Midi de Baalum Lo Matzi Mefer. The shliach matzi mashvi. In other words, says the Ran, it just won't work because there's no such thing as the person appointing a shliach to do something for him that he himself can't do. So now, if the husband would hear about it, then he would be able to be made for it. But the husband didn't hear about it. So in this case, the husband is ineligible to be made for the neder because he never heard about the neder. Now, how could it be that he could appoint a shliach to be made for the neder that he himself is ineligible of being made for himself? So therefore, the fact that the apotropos heard about it won't be enough. There's another answer which is given from the Rush, which you can see on the side of the page, which is that a person can only appoint a shliach to do something which is tangible. Milsa de memela, hearing something, you can't appoint someone to hear something for you. So ultimately, again, we try to bring a raya from here that he would be able to be made for a neder that he doesn't hear about it, because technically he would have been able to appoint a shliach to be made for his neder. The Gemara says no. Hachanami top of Ayin Gimel Amar Aleph. The Amar Lo Lechi Shamana. He says when I will hear about it, made for law, I will be made for her. The Gemara says Lechi Shama. La for lahu. What does he have to have an apotropos? What's the whole point in this? The guy says to his apotropos, when I hear about it, I want you to be made for the neder. When you hear about it, do it yourself. What are you asking this guy to do it for? Gemara says the same teretz. Savar dilma matridna. He's concerned that when he comes back, he's going to be too busy, and therefore, what he means is, when I come back and I hear about the neder, then I want you to be the one to be made for that neder as my shliach. In other words, again, the Gemara does not bring any raya that a person can be made for a neder without hearing about it. All the cases that we mentioned ultimately result in him hearing about the neder before he's made for the neder. And at this point, we don't have a raya to this question yet. The Ran does point out that while it's true that we don't have a raya yet, we still will find a raya later on to this case. Stop here. Have a wonderful day.